The former mayor who hid his affair from his wife but couldn't hide it from the world. Roy George stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office, watching the city pulse beneath him like a living organism he once controlled. The former mayor's reflection stared back at him, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than most New Yorkers made in a month. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from President Ronald Dump's team, each one more urgent than the last. A crisis was brewing in Washington, and as the president's personal attorney, Roy knew he would be expected to clean up yet another mess. The thought brought a smirk to his face. He had built his career on making problems disappear. The morning sun cast long shadows across his desk, where a framed photo of his wife Juliet sat facing away from him. He hadn't meant for things with Marissa to go this far, but there was something intoxicating about the young strategist that he couldn't resist. Their secret meetings in upscale hotels had become a dangerous addiction, one that gave him a thrill that his prestigious career and picture-perfect marriage couldn't match. Besides, he reasoned, what was power for if not to take what you wanted? The thought of Juliet discovering the truth barely crossed his mind anymore. He had become too skilled at compartmentalizing his life. Picking up his phone, Roy scrolled through the dozens of missed calls from Washington. The latest political firestorm surrounding Dump required his immediate attention, but first he had a lunch meeting scheduled with Marissa at their usual place. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the window, admiring how the years of power had shaped him into someone who commanded respect with just his presence. The city below him seemed to bow to his will, just as it had during his years as mayor. Even now, months after leaving office, his influence reached into every corner of New York's political machinery. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His secretary entered with a stack of newspapers, each one carrying headlines about President Dump's latest controversial statement. Roy waved her away. He would deal with the press later. Right now, his mind was already at the hotel restaurant where Marissa would be waiting, her ambitious eyes filled with that mixture of admiration and desire that made him feel invincible. He checked his wedding ring, a habit he had developed over the past year, ensuring it was securely in place before and after their encounters. The weight of his various roles, husband, lawyer, power broker, sat comfortably on his shoulders. He had mastered the art of being everything to everyone while serving only his own interests. The morning news shows played silently on the multiple screens in his office, pundits gesturing wildly about the latest political scandal. Roy allowed himself a moment of smugness, knowing that while they dissected the president's public mishaps, his own indiscretions remained perfectly hidden from the world's prying eyes. Juliet had left him a voicemail earlier that morning, her voice carrying that familiar note of suspicion that he had learned to ignore. She was planning another charity gala, throwing herself into social causes as she always did when she sensed something was amiss in their marriage. Roy made a mental note to send flowers to their apartment, a small gesture that usually brought him a few days of peace. It was a well-practiced dance, this marriage of theirs, and he had mastered all the steps. The city traffic crawled below like ants, each person wrapped up in their own little drama, unaware of the power plays happening in the towers above them. Roy gathered his papers for the upcoming lunch meeting, carefully selecting which documents to share with Marissa. Their relationship might be intimate, but he wasn't foolish enough to let an ambitious young strategist too close to sensitive information. Still, he enjoyed the way she hung on his every word, treating each morsel of political insight he shared like precious gems. His car waited in the private garage beneath the building, the driver already briefed on the circuitous route they would take to avoid being followed. Roy had built his empire on careful planning and anticipation of every possibility, and his affair was no different. He had contingency plans for every scenario, or so he believed. The thought that his carefully constructed world might come crashing down never occurred to him. Such was the nature of his hubris. A text message from Marissa lit up his phone. "Can't wait to see you. I have some interesting information about the campaign finances." Roy smiled, anticipating both the pleasure and potential advantage their meeting would bring. He had always prided himself on his ability to mix business with pleasure, to turn every relationship into a transaction that benefited him. The fact that he was risking everything, his marriage, his reputation, his political future, didn't register as a real threat in his mind. As Roy stepped into the elevator, his universe seemed perfectly aligned. He was the spider at the center of a vast web of power and influence, pulling strings that affected the highest levels of government. The doors closed on his satisfied expression, unaware that in a small newsroom across town, a junior reporter was putting the finishing touches on an article that would shatter his illusion of invulnerability. The countdown to his downfall had begun, but in his mind, Roy George was still untouchable, still the master of his domain, still convinced that power could protect him from the consequences of his actions. The New York Times hit the streets at 5 a.m., its front page dominated by a headline that would send shockwaves through the political establishment. Former Mayor Roy George's secret affair exposed, hotel records and staff testimony reveal year-long relationship. Within minutes, digital notifications lit up phones across the city, and news anchors scrambled to break into regular programming. The story was meticulous, backed by months of investigation, credit card records, hotel staff interviews, and time-stamped security footage. There would be no denying it this time. The evidence was irrefutable. Juliette Nadine's morning routine was interrupted by a flood of text messages from friends and family. Her hands trembled as she opened the article on her iPad, coffee forgotten and growing cold beside her. Each paragraph felt like a physical blow, detailing her husband's betrayal in excruciating detail. The reporters had traced Roy's movements for months, documenting his regular meetings with Marissa Ryan at the St. Regis, complete with photographs of them entering and leaving the hotel at different times. The careful orchestration of their encounters only made the betrayal feel more calculated, more cruel. News vans began gathering outside their Upper East Side apartment building, cameras trained on every entrance. Inside, Juliette sat in stunned silence in their tastefully decorated living room, surrounded by photographs of what she now realized was a carefully constructed lie. The article mentioned dates when she had been hosting charity events alone, believing Roy was tied up with presidential business. Dates when she had called him late at night, only to be told he was in meetings. Dates that now formed a damning calendar of deception. Roy was in Washington when the story broke, his phone exploding with notifications as he stepped out of a morning strategy meeting at the Trump International Hotel. His first instinct was to call his crisis management team, but they were already calling him. The story had everything: hotel receipts, witness statements, and even details about campaign funds that had been used to finance some of their rendezvous. His carefully constructed world of power and privilege began to crumble around him as he scrolled through the article, reading about his own indiscretions laid bare for the world to see. The reaction from the White House was swift and calculated. President Trump's press secretary issued a terse statement. The president is focused on serving the American people and considers this a private matter between Mr. George and his family. But behind closed doors, Trump was furious. "Fix this mess," he barked into the phone at Roy, "or don't bother coming back." The president's tweet an hour later was even more damaging. "Some lawyers should focus more on their jobs and less on their personal lives." Sad. The message was clear. Roy was on his own. Marissa Ryan had gone dark, her phone turned off, and her apartment empty when reporters came knocking. She'd been tipped off about the story the night before and had already fled to a friend's house in Connecticut. Her own reputation in political circles, carefully built over years of networking and strategic alliances, was now tainted by the scandal. Various news outlets were already digging into her background, looking for any previous indiscretions or patterns of similar behavior with other powerful men. By midday, the story had evolved into a full-blown media circus. Political commentators dissected every aspect of the scandal on cable news, while social media exploded with memes and harsh judgments. Old clips of Roy speaking about family values during his mayoral campaign surfaced, along with interviews where he had criticized other politicians for their moral failings. The hypocrisy was stunning, and the public's verdict was swift and merciless. Roy George affair and Shapur Juliet were trending nationwide. Inside their apartment, Juliet finally answered one call from her sister Catherine. "Don't you dare try to protect him this time," Catherine urged, her voice fierce with protective anger. "He humiliated you in front of the entire world." As they talked, more details emerged online. Text messages between Roy and Marissa had been leaked, revealing not just their affair, but discussions about sensitive political matters. The personal and professional violations were intertwined, each one amplifying the other. Roy's attempts to manage the crisis only made things worse. His hastily released statement, claiming that the story was greatly exaggerated and politically motivated, fell flat in the face of such comprehensive evidence. When a reporter caught him leaving his Washington hotel, his angry outburst, "Don't you have real news to cover?" was immediately clipped and shared across social media, becoming instant fodder for late-night comedy shows. His reputation as a skilled political operator was crumbling in real time. The sun set on a day that had changed everything. Juliet had finally left their apartment through a back entrance, seeking refuge at her sister's house in Connecticut, ironically not far from where Marissa was hiding. Roy remained in Washington, watching his phone as allies and friends gradually distanced themselves through polite but firm messages. President Dump had cancelled their meeting for the following day, his chief of staff citing a scheduling conflict. As night fell, Roy sat alone in his hotel room, watching the coverage of his own destruction, finally beginning to understand that some things, like trust and reputation, once broken, might never be repaired. The morning after the scandal broke, Roy George sat in his crisis management team's conference room, surrounded by anxious faces and scattered newspapers. The headline, "Betrayal of Power," screamed from the New York Post's front page, accompanied by a split image of Roy leaving the St. Regis and Juliet at a recent charity event. His team had crafted a careful statement denouncing what they called a liberal media witch hunt, but even they seemed unconvinced by their own spin. The room felt thick with tension as they watched their client, once the picture of confidence, repeatedly loosen his tie as if it was strangling him. Across town, Juliet's phone continued to buzz with messages of support and media requests, all of which went unanswered. She sat in her sister Catherine's kitchen, watching the morning shows dissect her marriage with a clinical precision that made her feel physically ill. The hosts speculated about how long she had known, whether she had been complicit in any campaign finance irregularities, and what she would do next. The coffee in her cup had gone cold for the third time that morning, but she barely noticed, too absorbed in the surreal experience of watching her private pain become public entertainment. Roy's first attempt at damage control came through a friendly conservative news outlet, where he tried to paint himself as the victim of a coordinated attack by his political enemies. "This is nothing more than an attempt to distract from President Dump's successful agenda," he declared, his voice carrying a hint of desperation that even sympathetic viewers couldn't ignore. The interview went sideways when the host, despite their previous friendly relationship, pressed him about the hotel receipts. Roy's angry response, accusing the host of joining the liberal mob, only made things worse. The political establishment began its swift retreat from Roy George. Senator Marcus Whitman, who had been photographed golfing with Roy just last week, issued a statement expressing his deep disappointment. Invitations to fundraisers were quietly rescinded. Law firms that had been courting him suddenly had no openings for partners. The exodus was particularly noticeable on social media, where former allies and supporters systematically unfollowed his accounts, creating a digital representation of his rapidly shrinking sphere of influence. Marissa Ryan's silence was becoming conspicuous. Despite multiple attempts by Roy's team to contact her, she remained unreachable. Her own crisis management team, hastily assembled by her father's connections, advised complete radio silence. But rumors began circulating that she was in talks with federal investigators about campaign finance irregularities. Each hour she remained silent increased Roy's anxiety. He knew too well how much she knew, how many conversations they'd had about sensitive political matters in what he'd thought were private moments. The tabloids were having a field day, publishing increasingly salacious details about the affair. A former hotel employee sold their story about delivering room service to Roy and Marissa, describing intimate details that made Juliet's friends gasp in horror. Private investigators hired by various media outlets began piecing together a timeline of the affair, cross-referencing it with Roy's public appearances and official duties. The resulting visualization, published online, showed a damning pattern of deception that spanned nearly 2 years. President Trump's inner circle made it clear that Roy's services would no longer be required. A formal letter from the White House counsel's office terminated their legal relationship, citing the need to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The president himself couldn't resist commenting at a press briefing. Roy George barely knew him. He handled some small legal matters, very small matters. I hear he's having some personal problems. Very sad. The dismissal was complete and humiliating, broadcast live across every major network. Juliet finally broke her silence, not with words, but with action. Her lawyer filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and public humiliation. The filing included a request for all of Roy's communications with Marissa Ryan, suggesting that Juliet's legal team suspected there was more to the story than just a personal betrayal. The court documents were immediately leaked to the press, adding another layer of public scrutiny to Roy's crumbling world. The conservative media machine that had once championed Roy as a rising star now turned on him with savage efficiency. Opinion pieces questioned his judgment, his morality, and his competence as a lawyer. Former colleagues came forward with stories of his arrogance and ruthless ambition. Each new revelation seemed to strip away another layer of his carefully constructed public persona, revealing the flaws and contradictions beneath. His attempts to play the victim only invited more scrutiny and criticism. By the end of the week, Roy George had become a political pariah. His office, once a hub of power and influence, sat largely empty, with only a skeleton staff remaining. The phone calls from Washington had stopped completely. Even his doorman, who had once greeted him with deferential enthusiasm, now barely nodded as he passed. In his darkened apartment, surrounded by evidence of his former life, photos, awards, press clippings, Roy finally began to understand that some forms of damage cannot be controlled, some bridges cannot be rebuilt, and some betrayals leave permanent scars on both the heart and the public record. The 60 Minutes interview was Juliet's idea. After 2 weeks of headlines dominated by Roy's denials and conspiracy theories, she decided it was time to tell her side of the story. The interview setting was deliberately chosen, her childhood home in Connecticut, surrounded by family photos that traced her 20-year marriage to Roy George. As the cameras rolled, Juliet sat poised in a simple blue dress, her composure masking the turmoil of the past weeks. "I believed in him," she began, her voice steady. "I believed in us, but Roy believed only in power." What followed was a methodical dismantling of Roy's public persona. With quiet dignity, Juliet revealed the pattern of lies that had characterized their marriage's final years. She spoke of finding hotel receipts that Roy had carelessly left in his jacket, of late-night calls that he took in his home office, of charity events where he was conspicuously absent. The most devastating revelation came when she described discovering that their anniversary dinner had been cancelled last year because, as she now knew, Roy had been with Marissa at the very same restaurant the night before, a detail confirmed by credit card statements. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Juliet, her hashtag #JulietSpeaksTruth trending nationwide. Women's organizations rallied behind her, recognizing in her story a familiar pattern of powerful men abusing their positions. Political commentators praised her courage, while mental health experts analyzed Roy's behavior as textbook narcissism. The interview's ratings broke records, and clips of Juliet's most pointed observations went viral. "He didn't just betray me," she said. "He betrayed every voter who believed in him, every citizen who trusted him with their city." Roy's attempts to counterattack backfired spectacularly. In a hastily arranged interview with a friendly conservative outlet, he suggested that Juliet was emotionally unstable and exaggerating for attention. The backlash was swift and severe. Even his remaining allies distanced themselves from what was widely seen as a desperate character assassination attempt. President Dump, ever aware of political winds, tweeted, "Some people should know when to stay quiet. Very embarrassing." The message was clear. Roy had become radioactive. Juliet's interview sparked a deeper investigation into Roy's tenure as mayor. Journalists began connecting dots between his affair and certain policy decisions, particularly those involving development projects where Marissa Ryan's consulting firm had played a role. The timeline of their relationship took on new significance as reporters discovered meetings that had been scrubbed from official calendars. Each revelation strengthened Juliet's narrative while further eroding Roy's credibility. The power shift was palpable in New York's social circles. Where once Juliet had been seen as merely the supportive wife of a powerful man, she was now emerging as a formidable figure in her own right. Invitations flooded in for speaking engagements, board positions, and charitable causes. Her graceful handling of the scandal had transformed her into a symbol of resilience and integrity. Meanwhile, Roy found himself increasingly isolated, his calls unreturned, his social calendar empty except for meetings with his lawyers. Marissa Ryan finally broke her silence, but not in the way Roy had hoped. Through her attorney, she issued a statement expressing deep regret for her role in the affair and announcing her cooperation with authorities investigating possible campaign finance violations. The statement pointedly mentioned that she had been led to believe certain financial arrangements were legal, effectively shifting blame to Roy while positioning herself as another victim of his manipulation. The betrayal was complete. His former lover was now potential witness against him. The media narrative shifted dramatically in the wake of Juliet's interview. Stories began focusing on her background, her law degree from Columbia, which she had set aside to support Roy's political career, her successful management of multiple charitable foundations, her reputation for integrity among those who worked with her. Each new article painted a picture of a woman who had sublimated her own ambitions for a husband who ultimately betrayed her trust. The contrast with Roy's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his relevance could not have been starker. Roy's last attempt to salvage his reputation came in the form of a public letter published in the Wall Street Journal, in which he tried to paint himself as a victim of cancel culture and political correctness. The letter was widely mocked, with several publications running point-by-point rebuttals. Juliet's response, delivered through her attorney, was devastating in its brevity. Mr. George remains more concerned with his image than with the truth. That tells you everything you need to know about his character. As the month drew to a close, the transformation was complete. Juliet had emerged from her husband's shadow to become a powerful voice for accountability in public life. Her first public speaking engagement at a women's leadership conference sold out within hours. Meanwhile, Roy George found himself facing not just the collapse of his marriage and career, but also the prospect of criminal investigations into his financial dealings. The man who had once ruled New York's political scene through force of personality and connection was now learning a harsh lesson about the limits of power and the price of betrayal. The first red flag appeared in a routine audit of campaign finances. A junior accountant at the New York State Election Commission noticed discrepancies in Roy George's mayoral campaign expenditures. Seemingly innocuous expenses labeled as consulting fees that didn't quite add up. The pattern might have gone unnoticed in previous years, but now, under the glaring spotlight of scandal, every financial document associated with Roy George was being scrutinized with unprecedented attention to detail. The accountant's report landed on the desk of senior investigator Sarah Chen, who had built her career on following paper trails to their often devastating conclusions. The web of financial deceit began to unravel with frightening speed. Hotel charges had been disguised as campaign events, intimate dinners recorded as strategy sessions, and private jet trips logged as voter outreach. The investigators discovered that Marissa Ryan's consulting firm had received regular payments from campaign funds, ostensibly for strategic planning services, but the dates and amounts corresponded suspiciously with their romantic rendezvous. Chen's team worked methodically, building a timeline that matched financial transactions with hotel records, flight manifests, and restaurant receipts, creating a damning picture of systematic abuse of campaign funds. FBI agents quietly began interviewing former staff members from Roy's mayoral office. The questions started with expense reports and gradually expanded to cover a broader pattern of financial impropriety. One former aide, speaking under condition of anonymity, revealed a system of double bookkeeping that had been maintained to hide certain expenditures from public scrutiny. Another described being instructed to destroy specific documents just days after Roy left office. The picture that emerged was not just of a personal indiscretion, but of a calculated scheme to use public and campaign funds for private pleasure. President Dump's reaction to the widening investigation was characteristic. During a press gaggle on the White House lawn, he shouted over the helicopter noise, "Roy George? Never trusted him with anything important. Some people say he was the worst mayor New York ever had. I knew it. The Presidential Distancing Act was complete, but it came with an unexpected consequence." Former White House staffers, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began sharing stories about Roy's questionable billing practices during his time as Dump's attorney. The floodgates were opening. In her Connecticut sanctuary, Juliet received a visit from FBI agents carrying boxes of financial records requiring her review. As she pored over the documents, her initial shock gave way to cold anger. The agents explained that some of the misappropriated campaign funds had been used to purchase expensive gifts for Marissa, gifts that Roy had claimed were for his wife. Juliet remembered thanking him for presents she had never received, another layer of betrayal in what was becoming an endless onion of deception. Her lawyer immediately began preparing additional documents for the divorce proceedings, now armed with evidence of financial fraud. Marissa Ryan's cooperation with investigators proved to be the key that unlocked the entire scheme. In exchange for immunity, she provided detailed records of how campaign funds had been laundered through her consulting firm and redistributed for personal use. Her testimony painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond their affair. She described offshore accounts, shell companies, and a network of financial manipulation that had been operating since Roy's early days as mayor. Her detailed documentation suggested she had been preparing for this moment for months, methodically gathering evidence as an insurance policy. The New York Times published a comprehensive exposé titled "The Price of Power: Inside Roy George's Web of Corruption." The article detailed how Roy had used his position as mayor to build a complex network of financial relationships that blurred the lines between public service and private gain. Campaign donors were rewarded with city contracts, while funds meant for public projects were diverted through a maze of shell companies. The affair with Marissa was just the visible tip of a massive iceberg of corruption that had been lurking beneath the surface of New York politics. Roy's desperate attempt to reach President Dump ended in humiliation. After dozens of unanswered calls, he finally managed to get through to the Oval Office, only to have Dump put him on speakerphone in front of a room full of advisors. "You're a liability, Roy," the president announced loudly. "A total disaster, maybe the worst liability ever. Fix your own mess." The call ended abruptly, and within minutes, details of the conversation were leaked to the press, adding another layer of public humiliation to Roy's rapidly accumulating collection. The investigation expanded to include Roy's private law practice, where investigators discovered a pattern of overbilling clients and misappropriating funds from escrow accounts. Former clients came forward with stories of padded expenses and questionable fees. The New York State Bar Association launched its own investigation, signaling the potential end of not just Roy's political career, but his legal one as well. The man who had once prided himself on knowing every loophole in the law was now being undone by the very paper trail he had arrogantly assumed would never be discovered. As federal agents executed search warrants on Roy's office and homes, the full scope of his corruption began to emerge. Safety deposit boxes yielded undeclared cash and jewelry. Computer files revealed a shadow accounting system that tracked illicit payments and favors. Even Roy's most ardent defenders fell silent as evidence mounted of systematic corruption that spanned his entire career in public service. The man who had built his reputation on wielding power had finally discovered its limits, and the harsh reality that no amount of influence could protect him from his own documented misdeeds. The Justice Department's conference room was austere, its wood-paneled walls witnessing countless deals and negotiations over the years. Marissa Ryan sat at the long table, surrounded by federal prosecutors and her own legal team, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously on a stack of documents before her. The immunity agreement lay unsigned, its legal language promising protection in exchange for complete cooperation. She thought about Roy, about all the secrets they had shared, all the promises he had made. Then she thought about her future, about the weight of federal investigations and public scrutiny. With a single, fluid motion, she signed her name, sealing Roy George's fate and securing her own survival. The evidence Marissa provided was devastating in its comprehensiveness. For months, she had been quietly documenting everything, recording conversations on her phone, saving emails, photographing documents. What had started as insurance had become a lifeline. She handed over text messages where Roy had bragged about manipulating campaign finances, emails discussing which donors needed special attention, and detailed notes about meetings with officials who were now under investigation. The prosecutors listened intently as she described how Roy had orchestrated a complex web of political favors and financial misconduct, all while maintaining his public image as a reformer. News of Marissa's cooperation hit Roy like a physical blow. He was in his lawyer's office when the story broke on CNN. Former mistress turns state's evidence against Roy George. The headline crawled across the bottom of the screen as pundits dissected the implications of her testimony. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A photo of Marissa leaving the Justice Department, head held high. The message below read simply, "You taught me well." Roy's hands shook as he poured himself a drink, the crystal decanter clinking against the glass in the suddenly silent office. The documents Marissa provided painted a picture of calculated corruption. There were spreadsheets tracking unofficial payments, lists of donors with notations about their special requests, and detailed accounts of how campaign funds had been diverted for personal use. Most damaging were the recordings, dozens of hours of conversations where Roy spoke freely about manipulating the system, secure in the belief that his words would never reach the public. His characteristic arrogance had become evidence of his own downfall, each casual admission another nail in the coffin of his career. Across town, Juliet watched the coverage of Marissa's testimony with a complex mix of emotions. There was vindication in seeing the truth finally emerge, but also a deep sadness at the scope of Roy's betrayal. The young woman she had once dismissed as just another ambitious political operative had been methodically documenting her husband's corruption even while sharing his bed. The irony was not lost on Juliet. Roy had been undone by the very qualities he had admired in Marissa: her cunning, her attention to detail, and her ruthless instinct for self-preservation. The media frenzy reached new heights as details from Marissa's testimony leaked. Cable news channels ran split-screen coverage, one side showing Roy's past speeches about integrity in government, the other displaying excerpts from his incriminating conversations. Late-night comedians had a field day with the revelations, but the underlying story was deadly serious. Federal prosecutors were building a case that went far beyond simple campaign finance violations, touching on potential RICO charges and allegations of systematic corruption that could send Roy to prison for years. President Trump's reaction came through his preferred medium, a series of early morning tweets that distanced him further from his former attorney. Never liked how Roy George handled things. Always sloppy, never careful. Now we see why. No loyalty, bad judgment. I only hire the best people, which is why he didn't last long. Witch hunt becoming rich hunt. The presidential commentary only added to Roy's isolation as former allies scrambled to avoid any association with what was becoming one of the biggest political scandals of the year. The final betrayal came in Marissa's primetime television interview. Seated across from a sympathetic interviewer, she portrayed herself as a young woman who had been manipulated by a powerful man, only to discover his true nature and decide to do the right thing. She spoke of her regret, her fear, and her eventual decision to come forward. The performance was masterful, vulnerable yet strong, contrite yet righteous. Ratings soared as she described the moment she realized she needed to choose truth over power, a phrase that would soon appear on t-shirts and social media posts. Roy's world had shrunk to the confines of his Manhattan apartment, where he watched Marissa's interview with increasing despair. Every revelation, every shared secret made public felt like another piece of his life being stripped away. His phones had stopped ringing, his email inbox filled only with messages from his legal team and journalists seeking comment. The young woman he had thought he was manipulating had been several steps ahead of him all along, recording, documenting, and preparing for the moment when she would need to save herself at his expense. The week ended with Marissa Ryan emerging as an unlikely hero of the Me Too movement, her decision to expose corruption being reframed as a triumph of female empowerment over male abuse of power. Meanwhile, Roy George faced the prospect of multiple federal indictments, his legal troubles compounded by the mountain of evidence his former lover had methodically collected. In the end, the man who had prided himself on understanding power had failed to recognize the most basic truth, that in politics, as in life, loyalty lasts only as long as mutual interest, and everyone eventually looks out for themselves. The indictment came down on a rainy Tuesday morning, the timing carefully chosen by prosecutors to maximize media coverage. 47 counts, each one meticulously detailed in a 100-page document that read like a thriller novel of political corruption. The charges ranged from campaign finance violations to money laundering, from wire fraud to obstruction of justice. Roy George, once the powerful mayor of New York and confidant to the president, was now officially a criminal defendant. His lawyer's office, usually a hub of political activity, had become a war room for what promised to be the fight of his life. The Republican Party's response was swift and calculated. A joint statement from party leadership called for Roy to step away from all political activities, pending resolution of the charges. Former allies in Congress who had once sought his counsel now publicly questioned his character. Senator James Morrison, speaking on Meet the Press, summed up the party's position. If these allegations are true, and the evidence suggests they are, Roy George has betrayed not just his wife and his party, but the very principles of public service. The political exile that had begun with whispers was now complete, announced in prime time for all to see. Roy's desperate attempt to rally support through conservative media backfired spectacularly. During an interview on Right Wing Network, he tried to paint himself as a victim of political persecution, but the host, armed with documents from Marissa's testimony, challenged every claim. When Roy suggested that the charges were fabricated by the deep state, the host responded by reading direct quotes from Roy's own recorded conversations. The interview ended abruptly when Roy, visibly agitated, accused the network of joining the liberal conspiracy. The clip went viral within hours, becoming a symbol of his unraveling. The legal warnings came from all directions. His criminal defense team, led by prestigious attorney Michael Blackwood, presented a stark assessment. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutors had built an almost airtight case. The State Bar Association had initiated disbarment proceedings, citing moral turpitude and conduct unbecoming of an officer of the court. Even Roy's tax lawyers joined the chorus, warning of potential IRS investigations into years of questionable deductions and unreported income. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his career, Roy's money and connections couldn't buy him a way out. President Dump's final betrayal was perhaps the most painful. At a campaign rally in Ohio, he devoted 10 minutes to mocking his former attorney. Roy George? Never liked him. Weak lawyer, very weak. Who couldn't even hide his affair properly. Who does that? Amateur hour, folks. I have the best lawyers now, the very best. Roy, he's going to have plenty of time to think about his mistakes. Lots of time, believe me. The crowd laughed and cheered while Roy watched the clip alone in his apartment, a glass of scotch trembling in his hand as his former boss turned him into a punchline. The exodus of clients from Roy's law firm accelerated into a stampede. Major corporations, concerned about reputational damage, transferred their legal work to other firms. Political consultants who had once depended on his connections now refused to take his calls. The firm's partners, seeing the writing on the wall, began negotiating their own exits. By week's end, the once prestigious Roy George and Associates had effectively ceased to exist, its name already removed from the building directory in an attempt to distance the remaining lawyers from their founding partners' disgrace. Juliet's divorce filing landed like a final thunderbolt in Roy's crumbling world. Her legal team, armed with evidence from the federal investigation, demanded a complete accounting of all assets, including those hidden in offshore accounts revealed by Marissa's testimony. The filing detailed years of financial deception, using Roy's own recorded words to demonstrate how he had systematically hidden assets from his wife while using campaign funds to finance his affair. The public humiliation of their broken marriage was now compounded by the exposure of years of financial betrayal. The political organizations Roy had once dominated moved quickly to erase his influence. The New York Republican Committee voted unanimously to rescind his Lifetime Achievement Award. Charitable foundations removed his name from their donor walls. Universities that had once competed for his endowments now quietly redirected his donations to ethics programs, an ironic twist that did not go unnoticed by the press. Each day brought new rejections, new distancing, new attempts by former associates to rewrite their history with him. The last vestiges of Roy's political power evaporated in a series of embarrassing revelations. Emails leaked showing him begging former donors for legal defense funds, only to be met with polite refusals or stony silence. A hot mic caught a senior Republican senator warning a colleague to avoid Roy like the plague. He's radioactive now. Even his own former campaign staff began speaking to prosecutors, each one eager to demonstrate that they had been unaware of their boss's illegal activities. The machine he had built over decades of political maneuvering had turned against its creator. By month's end, Roy George had become a cautionary tale in political circles, his name synonymous with corruption and hubris. His security clearance was revoked, his party membership was suspended, and his invitation to the annual Republican Gala was quietly rescinded. As he sat in his increasingly empty apartment, surrounded by the trappings of a power that had proven ultimately hollow, Roy finally confronted the reality that his political life was over. The man who had once commanded the attention of presidents and power brokers could no longer even get his calls returned by junior congressional staffers. The collapse was complete, and there would be no coming back from this fall. The decision to appear on American Tonight with Brian Palmer was Roy's idea, against the explicit advice of both his legal team and his remaining PR advisors. He had convinced himself that he could still control the narrative, still charm his way out of trouble, as he had done so many times before. The green room at the network studios felt smaller than he remembered from his previous appearances, when he had been a sought-after political commentator. Now, as he waited for his segment, he could hear the crew whispering and see them stealing glances at him, no longer with respect, but with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disdain. Brian Palmer was known for his methodical interview style, and tonight he had come prepared with a devastating arsenal of evidence. The interview began cordially enough, with Palmer asking Roy about his years as mayor and his relationship with President Dump. But the tone shifted abruptly when Palmer pulled out a stack of documents, hotel receipts, text messages and bank statements, all carefully organized and highlighted. "Mr. George," Palmer began, his voice steady, "I'd like to go through these records with you, item by item." Roy's confident smile faltered as he realized this wasn't going to be the friendly platform for his redemption story that he had imagined. The unraveling began with a simple question about a hotel bill from the St. Regis. Roy claimed it was a legitimate campaign expense for a strategy meeting, but Palmer produced surveillance footage showing him entering the hotel with Marissa Ryan. When Roy suggested the meeting was professional, Palmer read from Marissa's sworn testimony describing their intimate dinner and subsequent activities. The split screen showed Roy's face growing increasingly red as Palmer methodically dismantled each of his explanations. Social media exploded in real time, with viewers gleefully documenting every uncomfortable moment. As the interview progressed, Roy's composure crumbled visibly. He began to stutter, a nervous tic he had worked years to overcome. When Palmer questioned him about campaign finance violations, Roy's attempt to deflect blame onto his staff was met with damning emails in his own words, directing the misallocation of funds. The veteran politician, once known for his quick wit and smooth responses, was reduced to stammering denials that convinced no one. The cameras caught every bead of sweat, every nervous adjustment of his tie, every moment of panic in his eyes. The breaking point came when Palmer played a clip from Juliet's 60 Minutes interview, showing her emotional description of discovering Roy's betrayal. Roy's reaction was catastrophic. He called his own wife vindictive and unstable, suggesting she had always been jealous of his success. The studio audience audibly gasped. Palmer, maintaining his professional demeanor, simply asked, "Mr. George, do you really think attacking your wife, who stood by you for 20 years, is the best response here?" Roy's attempt to backtrack only made things worse, his words becoming increasingly incoherent as he tried to explain himself. Palmer then moved to the financial evidence provided by Marissa Ryan. Document after document appeared on the screen behind them, each one showing Roy's signature on questionable transactions. When Roy claimed the signatures were forged, Palmer produced a video of Roy signing one of the very documents he was now denying. The trap had been perfectly laid, and Roy had walked right into it. His desperate attempt to claim the video was doctored only added to his appearance of a man completely detached from reality. The interview's most viral moment came when Palmer asked about Roy's recent communications with President Dump. Roy, attempting to project confidence, claimed he still had the president's full support. Palmer then played the clip from Dump's Ohio rally, where the president had mocked him mercilessly. Roy's face went through a series of emotions: shock, anger, humiliation, before settling into a mask of defeated recognition. His whispered "Oh God" was picked up by his microphone and would become a social media meme within hours. Social media reaction was immediate and brutal. Roy George meltdown started trending worldwide. Clips of his worst moments were shared millions of times, set to music, turned into memes. Late-night comedy shows interrupted their regular programming to comment on the interview in real time. Even conservative outlets, which had once been Roy's safe haven, joined in the collective dismantling of his remaining dignity. The man who had once commanded respect was now the subject of universal derision. The aftermath was devastating. Roy's few remaining clients immediately terminated their relationships with him. Law firms that had been considering hiring him quietly withdrew their offers. Political organizations removed his name from their websites. The New York State Bar Association accelerated their disbarment proceedings, citing his behavior during the interview as further evidence of his unfitness to practice law. His own legal team began discussing whether they could continue representing someone who had so publicly self-destructed. As Roy left the studio that night, he found himself alone, truly alone. His driver had quit earlier that day, and no taxi would stop for him. He was forced to walk several blocks in the rain before finding a car service willing to take him home. In his apartment, he watched the interview replay on multiple networks, each one analyzing his downfall in excruciating detail. His phone remained silent. There would be no calls of support, no offers of help, no strategies for damage control. The final humiliation was complete, broadcast live for the world to see, and there was no coming back from this very public destruction of what remained of his reputation. The FBI raid began at dawn, a coordinated operation targeting multiple locations simultaneously. Agents in windbreakers, emblazoned with FBI, descended on Roy George's Manhattan apartment, his Hamptons beach house, and his law office. The search warrants were comprehensive, covering everything from financial records to electronic devices. Roy watched helplessly from his living room as agents methodically went through his belongings, boxing up documents, computers, and phones. The scene played out on live television, with news helicopters hovering overhead, capturing footage of federal agents carrying box after box of potential evidence from his various properties. The indictment, when it was unsealed, read like a catalogue of corruption. 37 counts of financial fraud, 15 counts of campaign finance violations, multiple counts of money laundering, and 1 count of obstruction of justice. The prosecutors had built their case meticulously, using Marissa's evidence as a foundation, but expanding far beyond it. They had tracked money flowing through a complex web of shell companies, followed paper trails through offshore accounts, and documented years of systematic corruption. The press conference announcing the charges was led by the U.S. Attorney, who described it as one of the most comprehensive cases of political corruption we've seen in recent history. Marissa Ryan's cooperation had proven invaluable to the prosecution. Her meticulous record-keeping had provided investigators with a roadmap to follow, leading them to discover evidence of crimes that went far beyond their initial investigation. She had recorded conversations where Roy had bragged about hiding money, documented meetings with donors who expected favors in return, and preserved emails that detailed the intricate schemes used to conceal illegal activities. Her testimony before the grand jury had lasted for days, each session revealing new layers of corruption. In Washington, President Trump's reaction to the indictment was predictably self-serving. Roy George barely knew him. He did some very small legal work. Very small. Everyone says I have much better lawyers now, the best lawyers. The president's attempt to distance himself only highlighted how far Roy had fallen. The same man who had once been trusted with Trump's most sensitive legal matters was now being treated as a disposable acquaintance, someone barely worth remembering. The betrayal was complete, but by this point, Roy had become numb to such abandonments. The prosecution's case was strengthened by unexpected cooperation from former members of Roy's inner circle. His longtime secretary provided prosecutors with detailed records of meetings and phone calls that corroborated Marissa's testimony. Former business partners, hoping to avoid their own legal troubles, came forward with information about questionable financial transactions. Even Roy's former driver agreed to testify about overheard conversations and suspicious deliveries. The wall of silence that had protected him for years was crumbling, as those who had once depended on his power now sought to save themselves. Roy's legal team, what remained of it, struggled to mount an effective defense. The evidence was overwhelming, and their client's disastrous television interview had destroyed any hope of winning in the court of public opinion. They attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors, confident in their case and aware of the public's demand for justice, showed little interest in offering significant concessions. The best they could hope for was to minimize the inevitable prison sentence, but even that seemed increasingly unlikely as more evidence emerged. The New York State Bar Association didn't wait for the criminal proceedings to conclude. Based on the evidence already public and Roy's behavior during his television interview, they moved forward with disbarment proceedings. The hearing was brief and devastating. Roy's attempts to defend his actions were met with skepticism and occasional outright derision from the panel. When the decision was announced, immediate disbarment and a recommendation that he never be allowed to practice law again, it felt like just another step in his ongoing descent into disgrace. Juliet's divorce proceedings moved forward in parallel with the criminal case. Her lawyers, armed with evidence from the federal investigation, pushed for a complete accounting of all assets. They discovered properties in the Caribbean that Roy had hidden, investment accounts in Switzerland, and artwork bought with laundered money. Each revelation strengthened both the divorce case and the criminal charges against him. Juliet's testimony in the divorce proceedings was brief but powerful, describing years of deception that went far beyond his affair with Marissa. The FBI's financial forensics team continued to uncover new evidence even as the case moved toward trial. They found patterns of corruption dating back to Roy's earliest days in politics. Campaign donations had been funneled through fake companies. Consulting fees had been used to hide bribes, and government contracts had been awarded based on kickbacks rather than merit. The investigation expanded to include several prominent developers and political donors, threatening to expose corruption throughout New York's political establishment. Roy's case was becoming a thread that, when pulled, threatened to unravel an entire system of political corruption. As autumn turned to winter, Roy George found himself facing the real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. His assets were frozen, his reputation was destroyed, and his former friends had abandoned him. The man who had once ruled New York's political scene through force of personality and connections was reduced to sitting alone in his apartment, watching his empire crumble and waiting for the justice system to determine his fate. The legal reckoning that he had spent his entire career avoiding had finally arrived, and there would be no escaping it this time. A year after the scandal first broke, Roy George walked alone through Central Park, a ghost of his former self. Once immaculate suits had been replaced by casual clothes that hung loosely on his frame. His hair had grayed considerably, and the confident stride that had once characterized his movements had given way to an almost furtive shuffle. Parkgoers who recognized him quickly averted their eyes or pointed discreetly, whispering about the fallen political titan who had become a cautionary tale. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now seemed to shrink from attention, keeping to the quieter paths and avoiding the areas where he had once held campaign rallies and press conferences. Juliet, in contrast, had emerged from the scandal's ashes transformed. Her memoir, Standing Tall, a story of betrayal and redemption, had topped the New York Times bestseller list for 6 weeks. She had become a respected voice on political corruption and women's empowerment, speaking at universities and conferences across the country. The woman who had once been known simply as Roy George's wife was now a force in her own right. her experiences resonating with audiences who saw in her story a broader narrative about power, betrayal, and resilience. Her divorce had been finalized, awarding her a substantial portion of the assets that hadn't been seized by federal authorities. Marissa Ryan had disappeared from public view, relocating to the West Coast, where she had reinvented herself as a corporate compliance consultant. Her immunity deal had protected her from prosecution, but the scandal had made her toxic in political circles. She had given one final interview to a major magazine, positioning herself as a reluctant whistleblower who had ultimately chosen truth over power, but the public remained divided on her role in the saga. Some saw her as a brave exposer of corruption, others as an opportunistic betrayer, but all agreed that she had played her cards masterfully in the end. President Dump had moved on to new dramas and new enemies, rarely mentioning Roy George except as an occasional punchline at rallies. The president's selective memory had airbrushed Roy from his inner circle, recasting him as a minor player who had barely registered in his orbit. When asked about Roy during press conferences, Dump would wave dismissively and say, "That guy? Never really knew him. They say he was a terrible mayor, maybe the worst ever. I only hire the best people, so he didn't last long." The casual cruelty of these dismissals still stung Roy, who kept a folder of news clippings documenting their once close relationship. The federal investigation had expanded far beyond Roy, becoming a comprehensive probe into political corruption in New York. Several developers had been indicted, 2 city council members had resigned, and a state senator was under investigation. Roy's case had opened a Pandora's box of corruption that threatened to reshape the city's political landscape. His former allies, desperate to avoid similar fates, had turned on each other in a feeding frenzy of accusations and counter-accusations. The web of relationships and favors that had once seemed to protect them all was now entrapping them, one by one. The legal profession had used Roy's case as a moment of reckoning. Law schools added his story to their ethics curricula, bar associations strengthened their oversight mechanisms, and firms implemented stricter compliance measures. His name had become synonymous with the dangers of mixing political power with legal practice, a cautionary tale told to first-year law students about the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries. The New York State Bar Association had made his disbarment permanent, citing his case as an example of conduct that brought profound disgrace to the legal profession. News coverage had shifted from the scandal itself to its broader implications. Investigative reporters continued to uncover new connections and corruption schemes, each revelation adding to the understanding of how thoroughly power had corrupted New York's political system. Documentary filmmakers competed to tell the definitive version of Roy's downfall, each finding new angles on the story of hubris and betrayal. Academic papers analyzed the case as a study in political corruption and institutional failure, while leadership consultants used it to illustrate the dangers of unchecked ego and moral compromise. Life in New York had moved on, but traces of Roy's influence remained like shadows on the city's consciousness. Buildings he had helped develop still stood, though his name had been removed from their plaques. Organizations he had once led continued their work under new leadership, carefully scrubbing any mention of his involvement from their histories. The city had absorbed the scandal and its aftermath, incorporating it into its vast tapestry of stories about power, ambition, and fall from grace. New scandals emerged, new politicians rose and fell, but Roy George's story had become part of New York's mythology. Juliet's final public statement about Roy came during a television interview that coincided with the release of her book. "Some people never learn," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "They mistake power for character, influence for integrity. I learned that integrity isn't about maintaining an image. It's about staying true to your values, even when no one is watching." The camera caught her wedding ring-free hand as she brushed back her hair, a subtle but powerful symbol of her liberation from a marriage that had become a prison of lies. Roy watched that interview alone in his sparsely furnished apartment, a half-empty glass of scotch in his trembling hand. The television screen showed his ex-wife looking more confident and alive than she ever had during their marriage, while he sat surrounded by the remnants of his former life, packed boxes waiting for his inevitable move to a smaller place, stacks of legal documents marking his ongoing battles with prosecutors, and newspapers documenting his spectacular fall from grace. As Juliet's words about integrity echoed in his ears, Roy finally confronted the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Power without principle was nothing more than an illusion, and he had spent his entire career chasing shadows. He turned off the television and in the sudden silence faced the ultimate punishment for his crimes. The long, lonely years ahead, filled with nothing but regret and the memory of what he had lost.